June 4th, 1943. Somewhere on a railway line in the heart of Texas. The pencil trembled in the soldier's hand, not from fear of the American guards, but from the sheer weight of the heresy he was committing against everything he had been sworn to believe. In a hidden diary, a German soldier, a veteran of the Afrika Korps, risked severe punishment and solitary confinement to record a single treasonous thought, a thought that would begin to unravel the very fabric of his reality. "The Americans must be lying to us," he wrote. "No nation on earth could possess such abundance, not while fighting a global war on two fronts. It is a spectacle designed to break us."
Through the grimy glass of the train window, he had just witnessed an impossible sight. As far as the eye could see, a constellation of electric light blazed across the Texas plains. Farmhouses, street corners, distant towns, every one was illuminated. In his Germany, blackout regulations had plunged the fatherland into a mandatory darkness since 1940, a necessary sacrifice for security. Even before the war, rural electrification was a luxury, reaching barely a fifth of the nation's farms. Yet here, in what Nazi propaganda ministers had relentlessly described as a decadent, racially inferior, and industrially collapsed America, electricity flowed with the careless abundance of water. This was the first crack in the ideological foundation, a fissure of doubt in a mind built upon certainty. But it would not be the last. This is not a story of a military battle, but of a psychological surrender. This is the story of how nearly 400,000 hardened soldiers of the Third Reich, captured and transported to the United States, had their entire worldview systematically dismantled, not through interrogation or forced re-education, but through the overwhelming, undeniable, and daily evidence of a reality they had been told was a physical and ideological impossibility. Welcome, everyone. Today, we are exploring one of the most fascinating and profoundly overlooked chapters of the Second World War. We are all familiar with the epic tales of D-Day, the brutal siege of Stalingrad, and the grueling island-hopping campaigns in the Pacific. But there was another front, a silent, psychological front, fought not with bullets and bombs, but with bread and butter. Not with panzer divisions, but with agricultural production. Not in the ruined cities of Europe, but in the sprawling, vibrant heartland of America itself. We are going to follow the incredible journey of these German prisoners of war, from the scorching deserts of Tunisia where they were captured, to the endless cornfields of Nebraska where they would be held. We will see through their eyes, read their secret diaries and letters, and discover how the sheer, awesome, and terrifying spectacle of American industrial and agricultural might accomplished what years of brutal combat could not: the complete and total ideological collapse of the Nazi creed within the minds of its most loyal and hardened followers. So buckle up. This is a story of shock, of awe, and ultimately of redemption found in the most unlikely of places. Our story begins not on American soil, but under the scorching North African sun. May 1943. The once seemingly invincible Afrika Korps, the veterans of a brutal, swirling desert campaign that had stretched across continents, lay utterly defeated. In Tunisia, the final act of the North African campaign played out as over 250,000 German and Italian soldiers laid down their arms in a crushing surrender. Among them were men like Hauptmann Friedrich Radke, a decorated Iron Cross holder who had fought through France and been wounded twice in the desert. These were not fresh recruits, they were the best of the Wehrmacht, proud, hardened, and utterly indoctrinated in the belief of their own racial and martial superiority. Their journey into disbelief started not in a classroom, but in the transient, dusty cages at the port of Oran, Algeria. Here, the Americans processed them with a cold, terrifying efficiency that itself was a revelation. The U.S. Army processed thousands of prisoners daily with an organizational precision that exceeded anything the Germans had achieved, even at the height of their power. Identity cards were photographed and filed, medical examinations completed, inoculations administered, and their Geneva Convention rights were explained to them in fluent German by American officers who had been specifically trained for this moment. But the first true gut-punching shock came not from the bureaucracy, but from the mess line. It was lunch. Oberleutnant Hans Müller, captured with the vaunted 21st Panzer Division, would later write to his mother in a letter that took months to get through. In the cage at Oran, while we waited for the ships, the Americans fed us better than we had eaten in 6 months of desert warfare. White bread, real coffee, meat twice a day. We were convinced it was a trick, a carefully staged show for our benefit. We whispered to each other that they were trying to impress us before the voyage. We didn't realize this was their standard military ration. This was simply how their soldiers ate. This was lesson 1, delivered on a metal tray. The enemy eats better than you. But this was merely the appetizer, a prelude to a feast of cognitive dissonance.
Next came the voyage across the Atlantic. They were loaded not onto hulking, grim troop transports, but onto Liberty ships, vessels like the SS Robert E. Peary, a ship that had been built in what the Germans would have considered an impossible 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes at the Kaiser shipyards in California. These vessels, the workhorses of the Atlantic, were returning from delivering vast quantities of supplies to the European front. Rather than sail back empty, they carried a new kind of cargo. Up to 30,000 Axis POWs per month by the summer of 1943. On board, the German soldiers, men who had lived under a regime of strict rationing for years, witnessed something that bordered on the sacrilegious. Feldwebel Kurz Zimmermann of the 90th Light Division kept a detailed account that would survive in letters to his family after the war. He wrote with a sense of bewildered awe, "The American sailors threw away half-eaten steaks, whole loaves of bread, gallons of milk that had soured in the heat. They did this openly, without a second thought, not to mock us, but because to them this waste was utterly meaningless. Their supply was limitless."
Limitless supply. For men hailing from a nation where every scrap of metal, every piece of bread, every lump of coal was hoarded and counted as a national resource, this was a profound psychological blow. The ship itself became a floating classroom in American power. From talk of American guards, they learned that the vessel carrying them was one of 2,710 Liberty ships that would be built during the war. Each one required 250,000 parts, assembled from components manufactured in 32 different states. The scale, the coordination, the sheer volume of things was already becoming incomprehensible. It was aboard these ships that the first seeds of strategic doubt were sown in the minds of the officer corps. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Stolbarten, whose aristocratic Prussian family had served in every German war since Frederick the Great, watched a radar antenna rotating slowly above the bridge, sophisticated technology the German High Command believed was their exclusive secret, possessed in limited quantities by the British, yet here it was, standard equipment on a mere cargo vessel. He would later confess in his memoirs, "As I watched that antenna turn, a cold realization settled in my stomach. It was then I first suspected, with a clarity that was terrifying, that Germany had already lost the war. We were not fighting a nation, but a force of nature." The battlefield defeat in Tunisia was complete, but the battle for their minds, a battle they did not even know they were fighting, was just beginning.
On August 2, 1943, the coast of Virginia materialized from the sea haze, a low green smudge that grew into a panorama of unimaginable power. For the prisoners crowding the rails, the site of the Norfolk Naval Base was like something from a science fiction novel. A vision of the future they had been promised was a lie. The base sprawled across 4,300 acres, its docks stretching for literal miles, a chaotic yet perfectly orchestrated symphony of organized might. Giant cranes, powered by clean, silent electricity, not the belching coal smoke that choked German industrial cities, danced along the waterfront, loading and unloading dozens of ships simultaneously. Gefreiter Johann Weber, who had been a factory worker in the industrial Ruhr Valley before his conscription, stood and counted 47 cargo ships in various states of loading and unloading from his vantage point. The mathematics of Allied victory were no longer abstract. They were being written here, in plain sight, in steel and sweat.
But the real cognitive dissonance, the moment that shattered the myth of American social collapse, struck during the march from the docks to the waiting trains. They passed vast parking lots filled with cars. Not a handful of official vehicles for officers, but hundreds, then thousands of personal automobiles belonging to dock workers, welders, and crane operators. In Germany, a car was a luxury reserved for the wealthy and the high-ranking party elite. The promised Volkswagen, the people's car, had been revealed as a propaganda dream, with fewer than 1,000 ever delivered to civilians. Here, in America, ordinary working men drove themselves to work in their own private vehicles. And then came the trains. After years of war, they expected to be packed into boxcars, the infamous 40 and 8 wagons designed for 40 men or 8 horses that had carried them across Europe. What they boarded, in stunned silence, were full passenger coaches, Pullman cars with padded seats that converted into sleeping berths, dining cars with white tablecloths, real silver cutlery and menus, observation cars with panoramic windows designed for sightseeing. Hauptmann Rodke wrote in his diary, his disbelief palpable on the page. "We boarded like tourists on a holiday excursion, not prisoners of a world war." And then, an American sergeant noticing the heat actually apologized to them because the air conditioning in their particular car wasn't working at full efficiency. Air conditioning! In the sweltering heat of a Virginia August. They had believed such a technological luxury existed only on Hitler's personal train, the Führersonderzug. This was their second lesson. The enemy travels in comfort you reserve for royalty.
The 3-day train journey from Norfolk to the internment camps in Texas and Oklahoma would become, entirely by accident, the most effective and devastating anti-Nazi indoctrination program ever devised. It was a rolling tour through the arsenal of democracy, and the curriculum was reality itself. As night fell on that first day, the prisoners pressed their faces against the cool glass of the windows, and the second great lie of Nazi propaganda evaporated into the humid American air. Every single town, every sleepy crossroads, every isolated farmhouse was ablaze with electric light. Martinsville, Danville, Greensboro, small communities that in Germany would have been plunged into inky blackness after sundown, glowed like miniature constellations, defiant and vibrant.
They passed factories running full night shifts, their windows a vast honeycomb of light, parking lots still packed with the cars of workers even at midnight. Obergefreiter Müller, whose own father was a dedicated Nazi Party block leader in Hamburg, wrote in a letter that would be discovered decades later, "We passed through dozens of cities that first night. Every one of them had more illumination, more visible electrical power than the entire city of Hamburg. When I mentioned this to a guard, he told me this was completely normal, that every American town had been electrified since the 1920s. I called him a liar to his face. He just shrugged with an infuriating calm and said, 'You'll see.' The landscape itself, they soon realized, was actively manufacturing victory. The train tracks ran past the Alcoa aluminum plant in Tennessee, a facility that stretched for 3 miles along the river, its massive electric furnaces consuming 175,000 kilowatts of power, more than the entire city of Munich. They rolled by the Rubbertown synthetic rubber complex near Louisville, where 4 massive facilities had sprung from empty fields in just 18 months. A German chemist among them, Oberleutnant Erich Hoffmann, who had worked for the industrial giant IG Farben, felt a chill of professional understanding. "I knew those plants," he recalled in a post-war interview. "I could see the distillation columns, the catalytic crackers. Each one of those facilities was more advanced than anything we had managed to build in years of effort, and there were 4 of them just in this one location. The guards told us there were dozens more across the country. The disparity was not just large, it was humiliating."
Then, outside Detroit, the train slowed, and they saw the crown jewel of American industrial might, Ford's Willow Run plant. This single factory, constructed in a mere 9 months, was producing a B-24 Liberator bomber with clockwork regularity, one rolled off the line every 63 minutes. At its peak, 42,000 workers assembled these complex machines from over 1.5 million parts sourced from 1,500 different subcontractors. The plant itself consumed 2.5 million square feet of space and used more electricity than the entire German city of Cologne. Unteroffizier Werner, a captured Luftwaffe pilot who had been shot down over Tunisia, pressed his face against the window, his professional eye assessing what he saw. "We had been told, repeatedly, that American aircraft were inferior, hastily built, that they would fall apart in combat," he wrote. "But I could see the precision of the assembly lines, the organized flow, the quality of the construction even from this distance. These were not inferior machines. They were simply being built at a speed we could not imagine was possible. We built aircraft with craftsmanship. They built them with mathematics." The foundation of their belief that Germany was technologically and industrially superior was not just cracking, it was turning to dust behind their eyes.
Arrival at the camps, like Camp Hearn in Texas, provided the next level of psychological demolition. These were not the squalid barbed wire hellscapes depicted in Völkischer Beobachter cartoons. They were orderly, clean complexes of wooden barracks, each equipped with electric lights, flush toilets, hot and cold running water, showers, and steam heat for the winter. For many prisoners, particularly those from rural or working-class backgrounds, this was a higher standard of living than they had ever known as free civilians in Germany. The camp hospital was a particular shock to the medical personnel among the prisoners. Oberstabsarzt Dr. Friedrich Bauer, the chief surgeon of the 164th Light Division, found himself working in a medical facility better equipped than most German civilian hospitals. There were modern X-ray machines, sterile surgical equipment, and pharmaceutical supplies, including the mythical penicillin that had been completely unavailable in Germany since 1941. And all of this was standard provision for enemy prisoners. They had penicillin, Dr. Bauer would later testify, this miracle drug that we in the German Medical Corps had only heard whispers about, rumors from neutral sources. They used it freely, without any apparent shortage, even on prisoners with minor infections. Our own soldiers were dying for want of basic sulfur drugs, and the Americans were giving their most advanced medicines to us, their enemies, without a moment's hesitation.
But the most persistent, daily, and psychologically corrosive argument against Nazism was served 3 times a day in the mess hall. The camp kitchen was a temple to American abundance. The prisoners assigned to kitchen duty discovered walk-in refrigerators, powerful electric mixers, automated dishwashers, and banks of gas ranges that could prepare meals for thousands of men at a time. The daily ration included fresh milk, eggs, meat, vegetables, and white bread in quantities that German civilians hadn't seen since before the war began in 1939. Feldwebel Otto Krebs, who had been a hotel chef in Munich before the war,
was assigned to kitchen duty. He wrote a line in his diary that was both heartbreaking and illuminating. "Today, we were forced to throw away more edible food than my entire family has seen in the last 3 years combined. Not spoiled food, you understand, simply excess. The American regulations require that we prepare 10% more than needed to ensure every single prisoner receives full rations. The surplus is simply discarded. Tonight I wept as I threw perfectly good, fresh loaves of bread into the garbage bin." This systematic, inescapable exposure to plenty had a documented psychological effect that American intelligence officers began to term ideological collapse syndrome. The most fanatical Nazis, the ones who had arrived spouting party slogans, gradually fell silent. No amount of ideological training, no depth of loyalty to the Führer could rationally argue against a full stomach, a hot shower, and a clean, well-lit bed. The evidence was too tangible, too daily.
By 1944, the booming American war economy was straining from a critical labor shortage as millions of men were in uniform. And so, in a final profound irony, German POWs were sent out to work on American farms and in non-war-related industries. This decision, born of pure economic necessity, would prove more destructive to Nazi ideology than any propaganda program could have hoped to be. It gave the prisoners a front-row seat to the very source of the abundance that was systematically stunning them. They were trucked daily to work sites, traveling through the American heartland without blindfolds or restricted routes. They saw everything. They saw the endless amber waves of grain in Kansas, fields that stretched to the horizon, each one larger than entire German counties. They witnessed a single combine harvester, operated by one man, doing the work of 100 men with scythes. A farmer's son, a teenager, would casually drive a tractor that was worth more than a German farmer's lifetime earnings. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffman, working on a farm outside Scottsbluff, Nebraska, wrote with a sense of awe, "The farmer's son, a boy of no more than 16, drove a tractor that was worth more than everything my father had earned in his entire lifetime. When I mentioned this to him, the boy just laughed and said it wasn't even a particularly good tractor. His father, he said, was waiting for a new, more powerful model to arrive from the John Deere Company."
In California's Central Valley, they picked fruit in orchards that stretched beyond the horizon. They watched, horrified and fascinated, as perfectly good fruit was discarded for minor blemishes, fruit that would have been treasured and thought over in Germany. Sometimes, to their absolute disbelief, entire crops were plowed under to maintain market prices, a concept of strategic economic surplus that caused near physical pain among men from a hunger-racked continent. Gefreiter Otto Schulz wrote, "They destroyed food to keep prices stable. They bulldozed mountains of oranges into deep pits because they had too many. We begged them, we literally begged, to be allowed to send them to Germany, to our starving families. The guards were sympathetic, but explained it was logistically impossible. The waste was not cruelty, it was a strategic proof of their unlimited resources. It was the most devastating thing I have ever witnessed." If the sheer scale of American industry broke their ideological framework, it was the profound and unexpected humanity of the American people that shattered their spirit. And nothing demonstrated this more powerfully than the Christmas of 1943. While their families in Germany shivered through the war's darkest winter, suffering under relentless bombing campaigns and critical shortages, German POWs in America were inundated with a gesture that defied all Nazi teachings about a decadent, weak, and morally corrupt enemy. American churches, civic groups like the Rotary Club and the YMCA, and the Red Cross coordinated to send over 500,000 individual Christmas packages to the camps. These were enemies. Men who months before had been trying to kill American sons and husbands, and they were now receiving gifts of candy, cigarettes, shaving kits, toiletries, and games. Local church choirs came to the camps to sing Christmas carols in German. The Boy Scouts of America troops delivered handmade Christmas cards. Communities formally invited prisoners to Christmas dinners in their own homes, though security regulations prevented most from accepting. For the prisoners, this display of kindness from their captors was incomprehensible. It contradicted the very core of the social Darwinist principles they had been taught. Oberleutnant Walter Müller, whose own brother had died in the firebombing of Hamburg, wrote, "They know exactly who we are. They know we are their enemies. Many of these people have sons and husbands right now, at this moment, fighting and dying against our armies in Italy and soon in France. Yet they show us this Christian charity. It is not propaganda. It feels genuine. What kind of people are these who treat their enemies this way? Only a people absolutely certain of their ultimate victory and secure in their own moral and physical power could afford such generosity."
The Christmas feast itself was a spectacle that belonged in a dream. The menu for enemy prisoners included roast turkey, baked ham, mashed potatoes and gravy, vegetables, pies, and ice cream. They ate until they were physically sick, unable to comprehend such luxury being lavished upon them. Feldwebel Hans Bauer noted with strategic clarity, "We ate like kings, better than German generals eat, better than our own party leaders." And the guards told us this was a normal, typical American Christmas dinner, that virtually every family in the country would be eating a similar meal today. If this is how they feed their prisoners, what in God's name must their own soldiers be eating? The implications are staggering. This kindness, this fundamental decency, became a strategic weapon more powerful than any bomb. It effectively separated the German people from the Nazi regime in the prisoners' minds. The Americans, they realized, were fighting an ideology, not a race. This distinction, which had once seemed like naive propaganda when uttered by Allied leaflets, now felt like a profound and operational truth.
This newfound openness and the shattering of their old belief system created an insatiable thirst for knowledge. Over 40,000 prisoners voluntarily enrolled in educational programs established within the camps. They studied English, American history and government, mathematics, and sciences. Prestigious universities like Chicago and Stanford provided correspondence courses. Professors, including Jewish refugees from Germany, came to lecture on democracy and economics. The prisoners read uncensored newspapers from across the American political spectrum. They watched Hollywood films like The Grapes of Wrath and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington that openly criticized American society, and they engaged in vigorous debates that would have meant a trip to a Gestapo cellar and a death sentence in Nazi Germany.
Lieutenant Joseph Kramer observed this phenomenon with a philosopher's eye. They hide nothing from us. They show us their problems, their social failures, their political conflicts. Yet this honesty, this self-criticism, seems to make them stronger, not weaker. In Germany, such criticism of the state would mean imprisonment or death. Here, it is considered a patriotic duty. It is a system that repairs its flaws in the open, and I begin to understand its resilience. They were no longer just prisoners of war. They had become students of freedom, and their captivity had become the most unlikely of universities. On June 6, 1944, the final, irrefutable piece of the puzzle fell into place. When news of the D-Day invasion reached the camps, many prisoners were gathered to watch official newsreels of the event. They saw the vast, unimaginable armada, 6,000 ships clogging the English Channel. They saw 11,000 aircraft darkening the skies of France. They saw the artificial mulberry harbors being towed across the channel to create instant ports, and the limitless supply chain that delivered 15,000 tons of material daily across open beaches.
There was little despair, but rather a grim, resigned understanding. The last vestiges of hope for a negotiated peace or a German victory evaporated. Oberst Friedrich von Tolden wrote in his journal that evening, "We knew then that everything was lost, not just the war, but the entire Nazi project, the 1,000-year Reich. We had challenged the world's greatest industrial power, the ultimate manufacturing nation, with fairy tales and racial mythology. We sent horses against their 10-wheeled trucks, bolt-action rifles against their semi-automatic Dorans, human courage against their unlimited mechanized resources. The contest was never equal. The ideological war was over. America had won. But the final, most devastating, and morally catastrophic blow was yet to come. In the spring of 1945, as American and British forces began to liberate the Nazi concentration camps, Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, the official footage was shown to the German POWs in America. Initially, many refused to believe it, screaming Lügenpresse and propaganda, just as they had been conditioned to do. But the evidence was overwhelming, methodical, and corroborated by countless sources, including letters from their own families back in Germany that began to confirm the horrific, unthinkable truth.
This was the ultimate, soul-crushing collapse. Men who had clung to some shred of national and personal pride as soldiers now had to face the absolute moral bankruptcy of the cause for which they had fought, for which their comrades had died, and which they had, however indirectly, served. Hauptmann Walter Schmidt penned what stands as the most eloquent epitaph for their shattered beliefs. We thought we were warriors for a great and noble cause, the rebirth of our nation. We discovered to our eternal horror that we had been the willing tools of criminals and butchers. We believed we were bringing civilization to so-called inferior peoples. We found in the ashes of those camps that we ourselves were the barbarians. The Americans we were taught to call weak and decadent showed us through their actions and their abundance what civilization actually meant. Our shame is complete. As the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the American approach to the POWs shifted decisively from captivity to rehabilitation. Understanding that these men would soon be returning to a shattered homeland, the U.S. government implemented an ambitious program to provide them with vocational training, agricultural education, and political instruction for the creation of a new, democratic Germany. They were even told about the nascent Marshall Plan, America's stunning commitment to spend billions of dollars to rebuild the very nations it had just spent years destroying. The prisoners, now converts to the tangible reality of democratic prosperity, were being actively prepared to become the architects of their homeland's redemption. Between 1945 and 1946, the 371,683 German POWs held in the United States were gradually repatriated. They returned to a land divided, destroyed, and destitute, a nation blanketed in ash and guilt. But they carried back with them something more precious than any material possession, a blueprint for the future, forged in the unlikely classrooms of the American heartland. The story, however, does not end at the docks of Bremerhaven or Hamburg. The German POWs who had experienced America firsthand became the unwitting seeds of West Germany's spectacular post-war rebirth, the legendary Wirtschaftswunder, or economic miracle. They were a living repository of knowledge about how a modern, democratic, and industrial society could actually function. Men like Hans Kroll, who had been a prisoner at Camp Shelby, would go on to become the West German ambassador to the United States and the Soviet Union. Walter Hallstein, who had organized educational classes in a camp in Kansas, became the first president of the European Commission and a founding father of the European Union. They brought back American methods of industrial efficiency, agricultural productivity and mechanization, and, most importantly, the democratic ideals of free speech, political pluralism, and civil society.
They had seen with their own eyes and felt in their own bellies that true and lasting prosperity came not from conquest and plunder, but from freedom and innovation. Not from totalitarian control, but from democratic cooperation. Not from racial purity, but from the strength that diversity of thought and effort could bring. The lessons learned in the Captivity of America became the intellectual and philosophical foundation for a new, peaceful, and prosperous democratic Germany.
The profound human bond forged in those unlikely classrooms never faded. In 1985, on the 40th anniversary of the war's end, over 500 former German POWs returned to the United States for an emotional reunion in Austin, Texas. They were grandfathers now, successful citizens of a free and democratic nation. Former Obergefreiter Hans Voss, who had been held at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, and had later returned to America to become a beloved physician in Georgetown, Maine, spoke for them all when he said, "For many of us, life in the camps was a vast improvement over the cold water flats and economic despair we had known as young men in Germany. We discovered running water, central heating, and abundant food. But more than that, more than any material comfort, we discovered dignity. We were treated as human beings by our captors, and that changed everything."
The keynote address was given by the elderly, respected Hauptmann Hermann Goetz. His words, spoken with quiet conviction, served as the final verdict on this incredible, transformative story. "We came to your shores as enemies, as committed Nazis, as believers in a monstrous lie. We left as friends, as Democrats, as men who had seen the truth with our own eyes and could never unsee it. We witnessed the arsenal of democracy not as an abstract concept, but as a living, breathing, producing reality. America's true weapon, we learned, was not its bombs or its tanks, but its inexhaustible capacity for creation and its unshakable confidence in its own ideals. We who arrived as would-be conquerors left as the most humble of students. And for that education, we are eternally grateful."
So what can we ultimately learn from this incredible hidden chapter of history? The story of the German POWs in America is, at its heart, a story about the irresistible power of truth. It proves that the most profound and lasting victories are sometimes won not on the battlefield with violence, but in the human heart with revelation. Not through the destruction of cities, but through the demonstration of a better way. America did not set out with a master plan to re-educate these men. There was no grand, sinister scheme of psychological manipulation. America simply was what it was. It opened its doors, however unintentionally, and allowed its reality to be inspected. The overwhelming, daily, and undeniable evidence of a free, productive, efficient, and fundamentally decent society accomplished what no amount of force or traditional propaganda alone ever could. It converted hardened enemies into lifelong friends, and in doing so, it helped plant the democratic seeds that would blossom into a peaceful and prosperous Europe.
It's a powerful and enduring reminder that a society's greatest strength lies not just in its capacity to destroy its adversaries, but in its inherent power to amaze them, to confound their darkest expectations, and to ultimately win them over through the sheer force of its example.
What did you think of this story? Had you ever heard about the German POW experience in America before? Share your thoughts and any questions you have in the comments below. I read every one. If you enjoyed this deep dive into a hidden corner of history, please give it a like and subscribe for more content that explores the untold stories of our past. Thanks for watching.